guys, I got really tickled when Abby accidentally said that the kickball game is adults versus grown-ups, because I couldn't help but hear that as major shade against some of you that are above the age of 18 and are technically an adult but do not qualify as a grown-up. It is actually a kickball game of adults versus kids. And I'll tell you, Kid City is also majorly hyping this up. And so if your kid comes out saying, we have to be at this kickball game, just know that might be coming. But if you are new, my name is Sharon. I am one of the pastors here at Bright City Church. And this morning, we are kicking off a 4-week series on marriage. And just kind of a fun fact about this is that our church is nearly 6 years old. And this is the first time that we have ever done a series on marriage. And there's a very important reason for that, which is that even though we have a lot of married couples in our church, we also have a lot of singles. And so whenever we're thinking about topical studies and things we want to focus on, we're always very careful that we don't want to single out one group to the exclusion of another. But there's a couple reasons why we decided to devote 4 weeks to this topic in spite of having so many single people. And one reason is simply that it is time. The fact that we are a church that is almost 6 years old and we submit ourselves to the authority of Scripture, and we see the theme of marriage woven throughout the Bible starting in Genesis. And one thing that we talk about when we plan out different topics, different books of the Bible that we're going to study, is we think in terms of a teaching diet. And we want to be feeding you this well-balanced teaching diet. And we realize this is just a gap, and it is time to address it. But in addition to it being time, it is also timely. Something that Ike and I have noticed an increase in recently is just so much of our pastoral care time is devoted to talking about marriage. We're seeing this increase in need in our church. And frankly, we're also seeing it among our friends, like our other ministry friends. We're seeing a lot of marriages under strain, a lot of marriages in crisis. And so we realize that this is something that we just need to give some time to teaching around. That said, before we dive in, I do want to address 2 groups of people here this morning. And the first is single people. If you are single and you're coming in here and you are wondering if, maybe you should just check out for the next 4 weeks, I really hope that you don't. Especially if you do hope to get married one day. We are going to be looking at principles that you can absolutely be working on now. But even if you don't think you'll ever get married, a lot of these are just relationship principles. They don't necessarily apply to marriage. And so I think you're going to find that there is something for you to learn in this series. But the other group that I want to address is people who are divorced or who are walking through divorce and are maybe wondering if you are going to feel shamed by this series or if you're going to feel condemned in some way. And I want you to know that my heart has been on you, my eyes have been on you, that we're crafting this in a way where you would not walk away feeling that way, but that instead we would be holding together 2 important truths. The first being that marriage is a gift from God. It is a good gift from God. It is not the pinnacle of our lives. It is not the pinnacle of the Christian faith, but it is a good gift from God. And also, the world is not as it should be. And so our experience of that good gift is very often complicated and broken. And so my hope is that we would hold those 2 things together as we walk through this series and consider how, in light of these truths, do we live wisely. Now, before I dig into the topic for this morning, one final note that I want to share, something that we're really excited about, and this is actually one final announcement, is that at the end of this series, we will be offering an entire marriage class. Because this is a 4-week series, it is not an exhaustive series, and so we wanted to offer another opportunity for you to dig deeper if you're really interested in growing in this area. And so that will kick off September 10th. It will be bi-weekly. It will go through November 19th. But the thing that I am most excited about with this course is that it is taught by Mark and Libby Acuff. And if you have been around for a while, you know their names because Mark is a retired pastor from this area. He's been around for a while. He is one of Ike's mentors, and they're really passionate about marriage. They have mentored literally hundreds of married couples. And so if you're also just interested in learning from couples who have been doing this a lot longer and to just glean wisdom from them, this is going to be a great resource for you. And so if you're interested, you can scan that QR code. It'll also be in the newsletter. We'll share it with it again, but just wanted you to know that that is coming. And then one final announcement as well is that in 2 weeks, we are going to be covering the topic of intimacy in marriage. And I'm telling you this now because it is a sensitive topic, and especially we have middle schoolers and high schoolers in the service. And so if that is a topic, parents, that you are not necessarily comfortable with your student listening to, then we are going to have an opportunity for them to go out of the service. Our student director, Paxton, will be in the lobby. And so we just want you to have that on your radar. That is August 25th when we will be covering that topic. With all of that said, this series, what we're going to be looking at is how to build, strengthen, and repair your marriage. And we're going to do that by drawing on a metaphor that Jesus hands to us in Matthew 7. And this metaphor is really about the life of faith, but it's a metaphor with a lot of different applications. And so I want to reread it. We just heard Alex read it, but I'm going to reread it. This is Matthew 7, verses 24 through 27, and this is what Jesus says. Therefore, anyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain fell, the rivers rose, and the winds blew and pounded that house, yet it didn't collapse because its foundation was on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and doesn't act on them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rain fell, the rivers rose, the winds blew and pounded that house, and it collapsed. It collapsed with a great crash. What I appreciate about this metaphor is that the truth that emerges from this is that what keeps us secure is not the absence of storms, but the strength of our foundation. This entire metaphor presupposes that storms will come. There is no avoiding that reality, whether we're talking about your marriage or we're talking about life. Storms will come. And so the better question then is not how to avoid storms, but instead how to strengthen our foundation, which then raises the question we're going to consider this morning, which is, how is your foundation? When you look at your marriage, what is the state of your foundation? And this can be a surprisingly difficult question to answer, and not for everyone. For some of you, you might come in and say, I can tell you right away, our foundation is not good. But for others of us, it can be a little bit tricky to answer that question accurately because so many of us, when it comes to assessing the health of our marriage, we are using the wrong metric. We're looking at the wrong thing. And to explain what I mean, I want to share a story from a number of years ago when Ike and I had moved into a townhouse in Holly Springs. And this townhouse was a new build, and so everything should have been perfect. But within a year of moving in, we began to notice this crack was creeping up the wall between our dining room and our living room. And so we just assumed, it's a new house, the house is settling, and so Ike pulls out his, putty and covers it over and sands it and paints it, and then we just assume everything's going to be fine. But not very long later, we noticed that crack begin to reopen. And so he pulls out the putty and he covers it over again. And then he ends up doing this again and again and again. And over time, the crack is getting wider and wider, and it's having other cracks coming off of it. And at some point, the crack is so big that the putty is not enough. He has to get this mesh thing. I don't know. I'm sure there's a technical name for it, but I'm not a construction person. But this mesh thing to put over it, and then he has to putty over that. But then meanwhile, because he's puttied over this so many times, it's not looking very good anymore either. There's only so many times you can do this before it just starts looking janky. And so that was the point when we thought maybe there's something else going on here. And so we call a civil engineer, and he comes in and he looks at our house and he informs us that it's not that the house is settling, it's that the foundation is sinking. And we find out that there was some error made when the construction workers initially laid the foundation. And basically, the foundation of our townhouse was kind of going like that. And so that's why this crack kept opening back up. And so then we had to call this company to come in and dig underneath our house, and they put in 10 piers under our townhouse, and they boosted it back up. But as soon as they did that and the foundation was corrected, the crack closed up. And then we didn't have to repair it ever again. And Ike and I, we think of this story often because it's such a great way of thinking about the way that we treat the problems in our marriages. Very often, what we are doing is we are only addressing the crack. And we're puttying over it over and over and over again, when what we really need to be doing is tracing that crack all the way down and asking what is in our foundation. What is underneath this that is causing the same conflict over and over again? And so that's what we're going to look at this morning. This is really just going to be a morning to diagnose, to just get a sense for what is going on. What is the state of the foundation of your marriage? And we're going to look at 3 different factors, but I also want to be really clear. Whenever we're venturing into topics that overlap with counseling, we want to be clear that these 3 factors, these are not clinical diagnoses of what is going on in your marriage. Rather, these are 3 big themes that Ike and I have noticed again and again in a lot of our pastoral counseling and in our own marriage as well. So with all of that in mind, the first factor that is in our foundation, that is baked into our foundation, that we bring in and that we build on top of without even realizing until it starts to form cracks, is unhealed pain. And for those of you who have been around for a while, you know that this is a significant part of mine and Ike's story. Because one thing that Ike has been very transparent about is that he is the adult child of an alcoholic. And that pain has bubbled to the surface in our marriage in a lot of different ways, but especially so in 2020 when we were leading our church through a pandemic. However, if you had asked me prior to 2020, how is the state of your marriage? How is the foundation of your marriage? I would have said it was great. It was excellent. We're very strong. And in many ways, that was true. We were really good at communicating. We communicated well. We went to marriage counseling once a month. We went on regular date nights. But part of the reason I also didn't see the full picture of what was going on underneath is that we hadn't, as a couple, walked through anything truly difficult yet. And that's one of the takeaways from this metaphor in Matthew 7, is that storms have this way of revealing, of exposing the true state of our foundation. To use kind of a slightly different metaphor, think about when you put weight on the foundation of something, that maybe a foundation can hold a certain amount of weight, but when you get to a kind of a critical point, if there is any weakness in that foundation, the weight is going to cause those weaknesses to buckle. And for us, that storm, that weight was 2020 and leading our church through a pandemic and all the complexity and difficulty and challenge of that year. Ike's inability to cope with his own pain and some of the less than healthy ways that he coped with his pain had a negative impact on our marriage. But I'll tell you, at the time, I didn't see it that way at all. And that's why this particular factor is the one that we misdiagnose so easily, because what we're doing is we're addressing the cracks, not the cause. You see, unhealed pain, the way that it manifests is in things like addiction, self-medicating with food, alcohol, drugs, sex. It can also manifest less dramatically in things like defensiveness, insecurity, and codependency. But what ends up happening is we're addressing the cracks. We're addressing the addiction, whatever it is, and that's the thing that we're puttying over again and again and again, and we're wondering, why has this not gotten better? Why does this crack keep reopening when what we really need to do is trace that crack all the way down and ask the question, what pain is underneath this? What shame is underneath this? As long as that unhealed pain remains unnamed, it is going to influence your marriage and your life more than you influence it. And I will say, this is one of those principles that even if you are not married, if you hope to be married one day, if you hope to just be close to any person, this is work that it really behooves you to start working on now. So that's the first factor that is baked into the foundations of our marriage, is unhealed pain. The second is unacknowledged relationship patterns. And I will tell you, this is what I brought into our marriage. I thought I was off the hook because I came from a very stable, loving home. And so honestly, both Ike and I thought he was the one bringing the baggage into our marriage. And so we both kind of put it on him that, like, you just need to go to therapy and you just need to work on your stuff. And then once you get that together, like, we will be good. But what I didn't realize is that just because you don't have trauma from your past doesn't mean you aren't bringing your own stuff into your marriage. And one thing that we all bring are these relationship patterns from our families of origin. These are patterns of relating, of communicating, of handling conflict, or of not handling conflict. That said, these are not always bad. They're not always toxic. They're not always dysfunctional. They might just be neutral. It might just be how your family did it. Or it might not be bad, but it might not be super healthy. It might not be best. But regardless, we are all handed these patterns that we imitate without even realizing it. And the interesting thing is we actually see this in the Bible at the very beginning with one of these early families. In Genesis, we read about Abraham, who's the father of Israel. And there's this weird story where he goes into Egypt and he is paranoid because his wife is so beautiful. He's concerned that he will be killed because of her. And so he passes her off as his sister. He tells everyone around him that this is actually not his wife, this is his sister. And it doesn't go very well, as you not at all are surprised by. And yet, Abraham actually does this a second time. And so we have a pattern here of him treating his wife kind of as this pawn to secure his own protection. But what a lot of people don't know about Genesis, and again, this is like the very beginning of the Bible, we're seeing this relationship pattern passed down, is that in Genesis 26, Abraham's son Isaac does the exact same thing. We have a story in Genesis 26 where he is passing off his wife as his sister because this is the pattern that was modeled for him. Now, the majority of us cannot relate to this specific way of relating. But we have all been handed these patterns from our families of origin. And I can give you an example from my own family of origin, which I'll tell you is a very tricky thing to teach because all y'all know my parents go here. And so I was like, how am I going to teach on this? But I actually thought of a really great example that happened about a year ago that was really eye-opening when my parents were moving here from Charlotte. And they moved into Durham. They lived just up 751. And I really love interior design. And so I said to them, like, let me help you, arrange your furniture and pick out colors and figure out what to put on the walls. And that was really enjoyable for me. And for the most part, it was really helpful for them. However, my dad and I had a significant disagreement about the living room couch. And the reason this happened is that the living room layout was very weird. Like the design of the house, it was hard to figure out the best way to put the furniture in this room. But I concluded that the couch needed to go on the left side of the fireplace because there was sort of this visual gap in the room there. And so I thought the couch can sort of fill in that gap. It can anchor the room and create a sense of balance. But my dad very strongly disagreed. And I also asked his permission before I shared the story, just so you know. So for him, his perspective on this is that if we put the couch there, it would be blocking his walking path from the garage to the kitchen. And to my mind, this was not a problem because there was a solid, 3 feet between the window and the couch. And also, he has legs and he can walk around the couch. And so I'm saying, like, what is the problem? And my dad is like acting out for me how he's going to walk and he's just going to run into the couch as if the couch just like jumps out of nowhere into his path. And I'm just like, this is ridiculous. Like, you could just walk around the couch. And so we're going back and forth. And then at the end of it, ultimately, I lost because it is not my house. And so I am not the decider of those things. But what was so interesting is that we're having this really heated debate. But at the end of it, we just kind of shrug our shoulders and then we go and make sandwiches and then it's over. And meanwhile, Ike is standing to the side like, what? Like, y'all were just about to tear each other's heads off, and now we're just sitting around the table, like, drinking our Diet Cokes. Like, does there need to be resolution? Like, I feel like you really hurt each other. And my dad and I, we just have that kind of relationship where we can be very frank, very direct with one another. And that is not right or wrong. That is just how he and I communicate. But Ike's reaction to that was really helpful for me in understanding why, when I do the same thing to him, he does not receive it that way. That it's actually very hurtful to him. And so it has been important for me to not respond when he says, I actually feel, this feels like deep conflict, this feels very hurtful, for me not to say, well, this is how I do it in my family. This is how we do it. Like, why can't you communicate this way? But instead to hear him say, this is hurtful to me, and to communicate differently because of that. And so maybe you come from a family like that, where you guys were the type of family that really hashed it out, that argued it out. Or maybe you came from a family where you guys just didn't talk about hard things ever. Maybe you came from a family where people didn't apologize. Maybe you came from a family where people didn't show any vulnerability, and maybe crying was sort of frowned upon. Maybe you came from a family where guilt or anger or the silent treatment were used to push the other person or to punish them. Maybe you came from a family that bonded through gossiping about other people. And I could go on and on and on. You probably can look and see how this plays out in your own life. But the reason that this affects our marriages is that if we don't take the time to notice these, if we don't take the time to hear from our spouses or people who love us that we have inherited these patterns, if we're just practicing them unacknowledged, is that we fall into this thinking of, I communicate this way because this is the right way. And the problem with thinking that it is the right way, there's actually really two problems. One is whenever you are engaging your spouse or really any other person in thinking, I'm doing this the right way, that is the moment when superiority enters the conversation. And not far behind superiority is resentment. But also, I want to take issue with this language around, well, this is the right way, because the right way is whatever works best to help both you and your spouse feel seen, heard, and understood. It doesn't matter how your family of origin did it, because this is not your family of origin. It reminds me of Jesus' words in Matthew 19:5, and he's quoting Genesis here. He says, "For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two will become one flesh." This is about a lot of different things, but it is also about leaving behind these patterns of relating that we inherited from our family of origin and discovering what works best for us. So that's number two, unacknowledged relationship patterns that we bring into our marriages without even realizing it. And then number three is unmet expectations. This is probably the most obvious one. This is the one that most premarital counseling classes talk about, the effect of bringing expectations into your marriage, because it's the one that very often, like right out of the gate, can cause conflict. I remember just for us early in our marriage, I was like a shower curtain closer, and Ike was a shower curtain opener. Like he would take a shower and he would just leave the shower curtain open, and I was like, are you an animal? Like this is how mildew sets in. And this is so common in early marriages where you have these minor unmet expectations around who does the laundry, who does the yard work, who handles the finances, who gets up with the baby at night. And these can create conflict, but it is mostly resolvable. However, there is another level of expectation that is significant, and it creates significant conflict in our marriages, because what we're talking about with these big expectations, it's deeply rooted. It has less to do with my expectations about how the laundry would get done and more to do with my expectations about how my life would go. So a few examples of this would include expectations around faith. Maybe you expected our family would be at church every Sunday. We would do devotionals every night. We would pray together regularly as a couple. On the flip side, one way I've seen this cause conflict is actually kind of the reverse of that, where one member in the marriage is really dismayed by how much their spouse wants to be at church. And it's kind of like, I'm a Christian, but I didn't sign up for that. That causes a surprising amount of conflict in marriages. Another big one is around sexual intimacy. Expectations about what that is going to look like in your marriage. This creates a lot of pain in marriages. But the one for me, the expectation that I brought to our marriage that caused the greatest harm to Ike, and was really my greatest failure as a wife, was my expectation of what a husband should be. Because I had this expectation that a husband should never struggle. A husband should never be weak. And because of that, when we hit 2020 and Ike was walking through his burnout, I had no category for that. I was completely spiraling because it was as if he had forfeited, he had disappointed what I had expected him to be, and I didn't know how to respond. And so what ended up happening in that moment when he really needed me to be his safe place, not only did I fail to be that, but on top of it, I unintentionally shamed him when he was at his lowest. And it's because of this expectation that I didn't even realize that was there until it had been disappointed. And that's what is so tricky about these unmet expectations, especially these really deeply rooted ones, is sometimes we don't realize they're there until they've been disappointed. But if you find yourself walking through that disappointment with a spouse where you're realizing in real time, I had this expectation and our marriage is not meeting it, in that moment, to try not to moralize that expectation. Try not to spiritualize that expectation, but instead ask, what is that expectation specifically, and where did it come from? Is it rooted in Scripture? Is it rooted in reality? Those are really important questions to ask. Now, we are going to spend the remainder of this series looking at how to strengthen our marriages, how to heal. And in the next 2 weeks, we're actually going to look at 2 key tools that can either help us to build strong marriages or can be a source of great pain in marriage. We're going to look at conflict and we're going to look at sexual intimacy. And you heard that right. We're going to talk about conflict as a tool, that it's not an enemy to our marriage, but it's actually something that done rightly can be a tool for greatly growing intimacy and closeness in our marriage. But for today, I want to leave you with 2 key takeaways. And again, I've sort of named the problem here without giving you a lot of solutions. These are going to be very, very simple, but please, please, please take time with these. During this week, if you're married, take time to process this with your spouse. If you are not married, take time to process this with the Lord, with your friends, with your roommates, whoever is close to you. This is so, so important. And this first, very small, very basic, very essential step is to name it. To name what is baked into your foundation. There's a phrase that I really love that's when you name it, you tame it. Because otherwise, you're just puttying up the cracks. You're just misdiagnosing the problem. And so it's so important for you to do that work, to look underneath, to assess the foundation of your marriage and your soul and name accurately what is really going on. And thankfully, our spouses, our loved ones, people who are close to us, they can actually be tremendous resources to us in that work if we are willing to listen. And so whether or not you're married, take time to examine wounds from your childhood, to examine patterns from your family of origin and expectations that you might have about how your life will play out. That's number 1, is to name it. And then number 2 is to own it. One easy temptation in a sermon like this one is to sit here and think, I really hope my husband is taking this to heart. And if that is you, I want to gently remind you of this little verse from Romans 3:10, which says, there is no one righteous, not even one. We are all bringing brokenness into our marriages. We're all bringing these dynamics into our relationships. Now, I do want to be clear that I'm not talking about situations of abuse. I'm not talking about physical, emotional, verbal, financial abuse. I'm not talking about, that is a different conversation. But the conversation here, I'm talking about how important it is for both of us to own what we are bringing to our marriages, what we are doing to our marriages. And part of the reason it's so important to do this is that at the end of the day, you cannot fix your spouse. You might know exactly what is wrong. You might be able to point to whatever one of these things are and say, that's it. That's what they brought into our marriage. But you cannot do that work for them. You cannot control them. And if you try, it is going to harm your marriage more. But what you can do and what you do have is a tremendous amount of agency over yourself. And so I want to strongly encourage you to do the work of not just naming what you have brought into your marriage, but owning it, confessing it, repenting of it as well. Now, as we close this morning, I mentioned we're going to go into more kind of getting to the brass tacks, getting to the practical takeaways in the weeks ahead. But for this morning, as we close, there is one group of people that I want to address because y'all have especially been on my heart as I've been preparing this message for this morning. And that's those of you who are here because you are in the thick of it. I know that some of you were not going to miss this series because you are going through a very hard season of marriage. And if that is you, I know you are probably wrestling with feelings of despair, of helplessness, of wondering if maybe something is wrong with you or if it will ever get better. And if that is you, I want you to know that you are not alone. Marriage is hard. It just is. So many of us are actively fighting for our marriages in this church right now. But also, if that is you, I want to invite you to think about this hard season of marriage a little bit differently. And this is something that I came to through our own hard season of marriage, is that there's kind of an invitation. Whenever we're walking through difficult seasons of marriage, there's this invitation, which is clarity. Whenever we go through hard seasons of marriage, whenever we face storms, the invitation is to ask, what is my marriage standing on? And more specifically, what am I standing on? Because what I realized as Ike and I were walking through our own season, our own hard season of marriage, is that up until that moment, I thought our marriage is standing on Jesus. I thought I am standing on Jesus, but what I realized, the clarity that I received through that hard season was no, our marriage was standing on Ike. I was standing on Ike. And so as long as Ike was okay, I was okay. But if he was not okay, then I was not okay. And no human being can carry that kind of weight. And so as we close out this morning, I want to return back to that opening metaphor of the house built on rock or built on sand. I brought it into conversation with marriage, but I want to end by reminding us all that really that metaphor is not about marriage. It is about Jesus, and it is for us all. Because the storms will come. Whether you are married or not, the storms will come. If you are married, you are going to face ups. You are going to face down times. But the good news of Jesus Christ is that no matter what happens, if we are firmly standing on him, then we are held. And so right now, as we prepare our hearts to move into a time of communion together, what I want to do is I actually want to invite the prayer team to come forward. And if you are walking through a season that is giving you the kind of clarity that you were standing on something other than Jesus, and that's why you are shaking right now, it's because your foundation was not secure, then this is a time where you can come, and we would be honored to pray over you, to thank God for that clarity, but then to help you make the changes to firmly root yourself in Christ. And then we also want to invite you forward that if you are going through a difficult season in your marriage, or maybe you're not, but you just recognize it is wise to pray for my marriage. That is how I contend for the health of my marriage and my family. I would invite you to come forward and be prayed over as well. So let's take some time now to commit these things to the Lord in prayer.